The scripture readings spoke a lot about temptation and evil. This is the beginning of the season of Lent, which is a time in the church of some people call it a journey through Lent. I don't like to think of it as a journey. I like to think of it as a time of reflection, to think about who we are and what our relationship with God and Jesus Christ is. But since everybody likes to focus on the evil side, I'm going to get that out of the way first and share a song with you that comes from a Vancouver band from a long time ago in the dark history of the rock era in the 60s, better known as the Poppy Family. Those lyrics may be 40 years old or more, but they're actually pretty timely for the age in which we live. Talking about the way that evil grows as attitudes within, and talks about the segregation of peoples and the building of walls. This is important today, not as I believe it directly pertains to the scriptures you just heard. Which comes to where I have these images on the screen behind me that say identity theft and who are you. So I'd like to go back into the past again, into the far reaches of my own family and my parents, me coming home as a teenage young man, full of life and vigor, and bringing my newfound friends home from school. And with my maritime roots, my father and mother would always say the same thing to anybody I brought home. Whose are you? Right? Anybody ever hear that phrase before? Whose are you? To whom do you belong? And I mention that because this is what you're hearing in Scripture today. These scriptures that you'd hear about Adam and Eve and the temptation with the serpent and Jesus in the desert and the tempter, the devil who tries to coerce him away from his life and his message, basically tell us you only know who you are when you realize whose you are. When we think of identity, most of us think we're in control of our own identity. We grow up being inculcated with the thought that, to be an individual and to establish your own sense of self. But the reality is that most of our identity is not forged on our own. It comes from whose we are. Most of our sense of ourselves comes from the community to which we belong. It comes from our family of origin. And it comes with the folks we hang out with. And so in that sense, identity is always given, even borrowed. It's not created. A quick example of this is, football season is over, so I can say this. I won't talk hockey right now. But no one wakes up every day and says, I think I'm going to be one of those crazy people who paints my face, wears a costume, and goes wild at football games, just rooting for my team. We don't wake up thinking we're going to be that person. But if you hang out with friends, watch lots of football, decide to go to a game, discover somebody who has brought body paint, and then all of a sudden realize you are one of those people. Right? You could say the same about women in purple or red hats in restaurants, or bikers. And I confess, I put on my leather and stuff and hang out with my biker friends, and we have an identity, and we know who we are. Or Trekkies, or just about any other of the groups we associate with, from which we derive a piece of our identity, or from the church that we attend, and where we derive our identity. And what it means is that we are adopted into an identity, whether we're born into it or we acquire it along the way in our life. It becomes a part of who we are. So we know who we are when we know whose we are. Now, the passage in the scriptures that you heard today about Jesus having been tempted in the desert comes immediately after his baptism. Right after he has heard the words, "This is my son with whom I am well pleased." Right after his identity has been established as one of God's. And his strength in his identity is that he is one of God's. Adam and Eve were of God's, and we know they were tempted away. But you have to understand the process. The process didn't happen by just, eat the apple. It's good, you love it. It began with the insinuation that God didn't know everything. That God was holding on to a piece of information maybe that they could have. It began with the breakdown of the relationship. The tempter breaks the relationship. Evil grows in cracks and holes and lives in people's minds. And evil grows in that dark. And then we start to build the walls and think that, I can be in control. I'm in charge. I have the power. Without realizing that's not where our strength comes from. But we hear it all the time. The good news we hear on Sunday mornings is that we are God's children, that God is with us, that God values us, that God loves us, that God promises to use us. And depending on the way your week is going, this can be pretty hard to believe by Sunday. Quite frankly, sometimes it's pretty dubious by lunchtime on Monday, because you step out of here and what do you hear? I need to lose 10 pounds. I need to be taller. I need to be more sensitive. I need to be something more than I am. Somebody's always got a comparison for us about why we're not good enough, why we're not strong enough, why we're not the right age. What's the right age to be, by the way? I've never figured that out. I totally admire my 4-year-old daughter, but I also like being the age I am, which is like over the hill to her. Like, man, they think I'm old. I don't get that. But what is the right age? We live in a world where ageism has become a problem. These are all temptations. Temptations to not know ourselves. Temptations to think we're not good enough. They stem from that primary temptation to forget whose we are. The minute we forget we are God's, we become unacceptable to someone else. And then we become unacceptable to ourselves. And then we forget. We forget our own goodness. And then we get caught up in the mob mentality of our world. Because once you don't remember who you are and whose you are, you do all kinds of things to dispel the insecurity that comes into our lives. To lose that sense of security and acceptance that is so essential to being happy. When Mia or Ian, my children, run into those difficulties in life, Ian especially, he's 10 years of age, he has Asperger's, he's a lot younger than the other kids in his class, and he will struggle with things, and he'll come into the house and from his mom's and just be so, Dad, I don't know how to deal with this. But he doesn't use those words, it's all acts out in other ways. And then you give him a hug and you remind him who he is, that he's my son, that I love him, that he can't be wrong in that. And all of a sudden it doesn't matter anymore that the others think that way of him, or he's geeky or whatever. And I see that in my own life, and I think if that's what it means to be a human and care, so much more love that God has for us than I can possibly hold as a human tells me that we're forgetting in this world whose we are. I had a wonderful conversation with my financial consultant the other day. He's Muslim, and we were talking about the event at the mosque recently over the solidarity with the Muslim people following the shooting in Quebec City. And he was just saying, his words, he says, what a hug that was. And it was meant to be that we were all of God's children. And I'm thinking, man, I wish that could be blazed across the sky for all the intolerant people to see and hear. To understand that when we know whose we are, when we know that we are of God, this is a world which nothing can tempt us away from. And that's what you see in the scriptures. You see Jesus being tempted, as was Adam and Eve, who did drift away. But you see Jesus not forgetting whose he was. And even though he was being given the temptation to take his identity into his own control and to have the ability to think that I can do it all on my own, I don't need anybody else, turning to the tempter and saying, get away from me, because I don't do this. And I think if Jesus had a strength, it was to know his own weakness. This is a man who later on in the Garden of Gethsemane would pray from his pain and his sorrow and his grief and ask God to take it from him. And at the same time he would ask this, he would know that God was still with him, giving him the hug and loving him for who he was and is. There's much in this world that will steal our identity. 10 years ago, I had my identity stolen. Somebody stole my wallet and my credit cards, and I discovered I was having a wonderful time in the Baltic states. Someday I'll get to go and see where I was. But apparently I had a great trip. But while I've had my identity stolen, I do know who I am. And sometimes I'm prone to forget. But generally I know I wake up every morning and have to say, thank God. Thank God for being with me in everything I'm in. Adam and Eve, we talk about them as being the ones to have developed the concept of original sin. I really like to change the word to original insecurity. Because that's what sin really is. It's that insecurity that allows us to break our sense of self, to break our relationships. That's what sin really does mean. If you go past the English and what we've done with it over all these millennium, from its original concept, it means to have a broken relationship. All that which breaks your relationships with your sense of self, with your sense of who you are, with the people around you, with the world in which you live, and with God. An original insecurity becomes walls. Walls and fear. And we're living in a world of original insecurity. So I'm inviting you to know whose you are. To reach out to the people around you and understand that these are the ones that we associate with. We draw our identity together. And I will never forget the first time I walked into this church, not as a minister, but as a person sitting in a pew. Right over there, actually. And was warmly greeted by people, and I thought, wow, this is a place I can come to work. So I did. I'm sorry for you. But we are God's beloved children. And it's ours to invite others to join us and to hang out at church and be surrounded by a family of faith that will keep on telling each one that they are indeed, all of us, of value and of worth and of purpose, and that we are all God's beloved children. So I would like to say thank you for sharing this incredibly important promise of God, and for sharing in this identity that is mine. And maybe what we want to do is just to remind each other once in a while that you are special and that we're glad you're here.